It is time to start. We are on page 25. We'll be taking up in chapter 7 at about verse 15 and conclude this chapter. And then we'll cover chapter 8 is my plans, the entire chapter Sunday. So good evening. I hope everybody is well and has had a good week. It's good to see you. So we'll delve in again to this language of the author, the preacher, as he's trying to himself, as he says, I've looked at things and I've looked at things and I still haven't got them figured out. And, you know, if the author was Solomon, I certainly would think you would be in agreement with me. He's smarter than we all are. If he couldn't figure it out, can we? So we'll look into that, but again, it's good to see you, especially those that are visiting with us. So we'll get started. I've asked Jason to open our class tonight with a word of prayer, so let folks get situated here in just a moment, and then we'll get started. Okay, let's bow our heads as Jason leads us.
Lord, our great and awesome God, we're so grateful for the opportunity that you have given us to come and be together, assemble as Christians. God, help us to clear our thoughts, clear our minds of things of the world so we can focus fully and totally on your word. Lord, we're so blessed to have your inspired word that we can read, that you have granted us a lot of knowledge, wisdom, a lot of insight into things that we would have had no idea otherwise. Help us as we try to think through these things, realize that true wisdom lies in obedience to your word. God, we're thankful for Roger for taking up the class. You'll help him to present things in a way that makes things easier for us, that we can think through what the writer of Ecclesiastes was writing. Help us to understand your will for us in our lives so that we can live our lives in service to you, that we can honor you through the way that we obey, through the way that we treat others, through the way that we just live our lives in service. Now be with all those who are in class right now. Help the teachers to teach, help the students to learn. And help us to all be closer to you because of what we do here tonight.
Amen. Thank you. If I were to summarize this chapter, I would begin by saying, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? Does that seem just and fair? Seems just the opposite to me. But that, in fact, is what happens. So why do bad things happen to good people and good things fall upon bad people? As this chapter brings out, I think, probably more so than any other chapter of the book, these things seem to be that way. But we're not God. Someone that we may think is good and righteous may in reality not be. And someone who we think is a very vicious and evil person may not be that at all. You recall from the book of Job, his three friends, what was their conclusion about Job's suffering? Why was it coming upon Job? Was it true? So they had a very misconception about Job's sufferings. Bad things were happening to a good man. But in their eyes, he had to have been an evil person, or this wouldn't have happened. So they were wrong in their estimation of Job. We can be that way. We don't know the truth. And sometimes we might be in denial about ourselves in that regard. We may have a view of ourselves that we are good and righteous and godly. But in reality, we may be doing some things in secret that other humans can't see, but God sees and we know. And just the opposite is true. And so, God knowing this, I thought I'd advance that. Okay, where's my audio man? Chapter 7, verses 13 and 14 kindly summed up what leads us into tonight. God, the work of God is that of straightening what needs straightened. And as we've talked about from the outset of the book, God made man upright. The last verse of this chapter actually bears that out, and it's kind of like the end of the book. The end of this chapter, chapter 7, he makes a statement, God made men upright, but they've sought out many devices. So when God made us, we were without sin, everything was fine. What did we do? We disobeyed. So God is in the business of straightening out man. And so there are people that appear to be righteous. Thank you, Brad. In our eyes. But we may be wrong, just like Job's 3 friends were of him. And we may have a self-righteous view of ourselves, simply because we don't want our darkness to be revealed. And the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John talks about that people love the darkness. So the crooked needing to be straightened explains the need to have wisdom in making these estimations about ourselves and others. And that's what the rest of this chapter is talking about. But from Genesis 3 and Romans 8:20, this world was subjected to futility because of disobedience. And we know from Romans 3 and verse 23 that none of us are excluded from that. But it is easy for us to sit in judgment of everybody but ourselves and point out what's wrong with the other person, when in reality there's things in our life that we need to have straightened out. So this is kind of what we talked about in the first 14 verses. So as we begin tonight, just keep in mind this is what we're going to be discussing. The work of God as it relates to the crooked needing to be straightened. And God is doing this because He desires all men to be saved. Beginning at verse 15, the author says, I've seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There's a righteous person who perishes in his righteousness. There's a wicked person that prolongs his life in his wickedness. Do not be excessively righteous, and don't be overly wise. Why should you ruin yourself? And don't be excessively wicked, and don't be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It's good that you grasp one thing while not letting go of the other, for one who fears God comes out with both of them. What does he mean here? Let's take for a moment, jump ahead to the next chapter and look at verse 14 of chapter 8, because that is saying the same thing as these 3 verses. In chapter 8 and verse 14, there is a futility which is done on earth. That is, there are righteous men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. And on the other hand, there's evil men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I say that this too is futility. And so you see that he's addressing the thing that I opened up with. Bad things happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people. Why is it? That's a futility. But why does it happen? And he's going to deal with that in this chapter. There are several key phrases in these 3 verses, or 4 verses. First thing, he says, I've seen everything during my lifetime of futility. First of all, this phrase, lifetime of futility, he's simply saying that I've seen it all in my brief life. Futility here is just a reference to the brevity of life. Job made the statement that my days are a breath. Riches are said to have a brief existence, especially those riches that are gained unjustly. In chapter 11 and verse 10 of this book of Ecclesiastes, childhood and youth are described as very brief. And he says that we're told also in the Bible that idols are said to be worthless, and all who go after them become worthless or futile. And so this is the idea. The author said, I've seen everything during my brief existence. But he's not talking about his whole life. My lifetime of futility. Do you remember in the early classes when we were going over the terms and going over who the author might be? If this author was Solomon, I gave you some information that evidence in support of that was this, that this book was written by Solomon, who served God early in his life. He fell away. His heart was led astray by the many wives, and then he repented. What did he see during his time of life that he was in apostasy? This is the period of time. He said, during this time of my life, when I was serving idols, when I was away from God, this is what I saw, these things here. And so he's talking about in this chapter, why do these things happen? Some other key phrases in these same verses are what I have underlined in red and in blue. Let's first notice these verses in red and talk about beginning. There is a righteous person who perishes in his righteousness. What kind of righteousness do you think he's talking about? We've only got two possibilities. There is a person, a righteous person, that perishes in true righteousness, or there is a righteous person that perishes in his self-righteousness. Which one is meant contextually? I think here are some keys that tell us. First of all, he says, don't be overly righteous. Okay? Let me go ahead a couple of slides here, right here. Don't be overly righteous. If true righteousness was what was meant contextually, is it possible that you can overdo your obedience to God? Can you be overly obedient? You can't, can you? But you can be overly obedient in self-righteousness, okay? And so, don't be overly or excessively self-righteous. But what about this? It'd be just the opposite of self-righteousness. There are some people, and you may know, and you may have said this about yourself at some point in your life. I've done so many terrible things, or I've lived, there's no way God could forgive me. Have you ever heard anybody make a statement like that? Their view of themselves that I'm just so rotten, there's no way God could forgive me. That's just as bad as being self-righteous. When you have an estimation of yourself that there is no forgiveness from God, you won't pursue let me find it here. I've got it. What Jesus said about coming to God in Matthew 11, verse 28, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. When people have such a self-abasement of themselves, that they won't even bother trying to come to Christ, because they've convinced themselves that they're not going to be forgiven. That's just as bad as the other. And so the righteousness here, when he's talking about there is a righteous person that perishes in his self-righteousness, and there's a wicked person that prolongs his life in his self-abasement. Remember chapter 8 and verse 14. There are things that happens to righteous people according to wicked people, and there are things that happen according to wicked people that should be according to the righteous. So that's why he could say, don't be overly either way. Another piece of evidence that I think is a good indication that this is not talking about true righteousness is in verse 18. Because he says in verse 18, the one who fears God comes out with both of them. And this is from the New American Standard. But in the several other versions, it's rendered, the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. The one who is truly righteous will emerge from the self-righteous and the self-abased. He will stand out. So those are why I think contextually we should understand that the type of person he's talking about here, the type of righteousness rather, is self-righteousness, okay? These are the reasons that I think the context supports that, okay? It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand. For the one who fears God shall come forth, or shall come out from both of them, not with both of them. And so, if it was talking about true righteousness, how would the one who fears God be separated from one who is truly righteous? You see, he wouldn't, okay? So, I think that is evidence in support that the righteousness that is talked about here is self-righteousness, okay? And we also find that this is supported in Romans 12, verse 3, Psalm 73, and verse 3 as well, okay? And so we have those passages that I think pretty well define that for us. Now, we've already looked at chapter 8 and verse 14 to help us understand this language in verse 15. Here, these passages that I have here, in Psalm 73 and verse 3, this was a psalm of Asaph. He dealt with this subject in Psalms chapter 73, and I want us to just briefly look at that, okay? In Psalms chapter 73, the first 18 verses. We're not going to read all of them, but here in this psalm, Asaph said in verses 12 through 14, as he observed the wicked, again, these were people who appeared to have been, in Asaph's eyes, he said, they appear to be blessed, they appear to increase in their riches, but he says, for myself, it's just the opposite. But yet I am serving God and they are not. So he was perplexed with this. In Psalm chapter 73, beginning in verse 12, Asaph wrote these words, behold, these are the wicked. They're always at ease, and they increase in riches. And all in vain have I kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. For all the day long I've been stricken and rebuked every morning. And if you read this and then you go on down, he concludes in verse 18 that the reality is, God, truly you set the wicked in slippery places and you make them fall to ruin. So the point being is this. It may be in our eyes that a person is wicked, when in reality they may not be. And we may regard someone righteous who in reality may not be. We can't judge that they are righteous and wicked by prosperity or affliction. As we saw with Job. Was Job a righteous person? But look at all the affliction that came upon him. Was God unjust in doing that? Did God treat Job unfairly? why did this happen to Job? You ever thought about that? Why did all this disaster, why did God allow it to happen to Job? This is what he's talking about here. Those that it befalls upon them according to the wicked. The point for us being, and this is what the author said, I can't figure it out. During my years that I was away, why wasn't I destroyed? I've talked about in previous classes King David, when he committed adultery with Bathsheba. What did he do to cover it up? What did he do to her husband? Any other people have to die to make sure that he got murdered? Were they innocent victims? A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of women became widows. A lot of children became orphans because David was trying to cover up an adulterous affair. Was God just? We don't know why everything happens the way that it does. Innocent people suffer. Wicked people seem to never have a day of misery, don't they? It's hard for us to understand from our earthly viewpoint. But God is straightening, the crooked need straightening. And as Asaph noted here, there will come a day and time God has appointed for the wicked to get what's due to them. Things are appointed from God. And it's wise for us to not be overly wordy, frustrated with our speech, and talk a lot and just question and murmur and grumble. This was what plagued the children of Israel. They didn't like how things were being done by God. They even went so far as to say, our old life in Egypt, oh, we didn't have this misery. We're quick to forget. So God takes care of the wicked on His own time frame, okay? And we need to remember that. Those whose suffering is deemed unfair may not be as we suppose them to be. Again, Job's three friends were wrong about him. Verse 16 of chapter 7, when he says, don't be overly wise. That's to be understood like Proverbs 3 and verse 7. Don't be wise in your own eyes, but rather fear God and turn away from evil. This same reasoning is to be applied in verse 17, and we know that to be the case because in verse 18 he says, the man who fears God will come out from among them. And he says that same thing again in verse 26 of this chapter when he says, one who is pleasing to God will escape this evil woman that we're going to get to in just a moment, okay? Any question or comment? As we go on, verse 19. Wisdom strengthens a wise person more than 10 rulers who are in a city. And indeed, there's not a righteous person on earth who always does good and does not ever sin. Also, don't take seriously all the words that are spoken, so that you do not hear your servant cursing you, for you know that even you have cursed others many times as well. Well, what does that tell us about ourselves? Are we innocent? Again, Romans 3:23 class, and this is what he's talking about here. It is wise to be honest about ourselves. Wisdom strengthens a wise person. Wisdom doesn't make a wise person wise. There is a wise person. There's a lot of wise people, but wisdom from God will strengthen that person and help him to understand these inequities of life. Why do bad things happen to good people? And why do good things happen to bad people? This is God's doing. We shouldn't gripe about it. We shouldn't question God. We should know God is in control. If they're prospered, it's not by their own doing. God has willed it. If they fall, they're not innocent. God is doing it. One thing about just when I mentioned Solomon earlier that I want to, this thought reminded me of something that I want to point out. You know, Solomon prayed for wisdom, didn't he? He's typically describing, when you're asked the question, in the Bible, who's the wisest man that ever lived? Who comes to the top of the water? But remember this, the apostles' responsibility that Jesus told to go into all the world, their role was to make known what had been kept a mystery from the foundation of the world. That means that Solomon did not know things that the apostles revealed. We know these things. So Solomon may have been wise in that respect, but the mystery of godliness that the apostles made known, he did not know. Any more than Isaiah the prophet knew who he was writing about when the eunuch said he was led as a lamb. The eunuch asked, who was he talking about? Isaiah couldn't tell him. That's Jesus of Nazareth, because Isaiah didn't know it. It hadn't been revealed. He knew a Messiah would be coming, but he didn't know who the Messiah was because the mystery had not been made known. And Solomon, in all his wisdom, did not know the things that we know because the gospel has been preached. So, I say all that to say, being wise unto salvation, we are not behind Solomon at all. We've had the gospel, but God's wisdom strengthens us. So we need to having this wisdom, we know what about ourselves. Romans 3:23 includes each of us, don't it? So let's not question about who's the things that are said about you. Don't take seriously what's spoken about you. What's verse 22 say? You've never done that, have you? We need to accept God's wisdom. Was Solomon, or whoever the author was he correct in this statement? We've all been guilty of talking, slandering, saying things that ought not to have been said. So, the rest of this chapter really helps us to understand whether or not we're accurate thus far through verse 22. They indicate a truth that even the author says, I've looked, I've seen this, and I just don't have an answer. An answer to what? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things befall bad people? He didn't know it. The only thing he knew of was what he said in the last verse. He said, this is the only thing that I'm 100% positively certain of. God made man upright, but they've sought out many devices. That I know. The rest of this I'm not sure of. But it indicates what we need to accept when we tend to think, oh, I know why this is happening, and I know this, and I know that. We don't know the truth about the lives of people. We could be wrong just like Job's friend. We may think that this person is suffering because of how they've lived. They're just not serving Christ. They're not faithful. Have we ever made that statement about someone else? Well, they're not faithful. as if I am faithful. Have we ever had that self-righteous attitude? This is what he's addressing, I think. So we need to be careful with our words. We've read about too much words. We need to judge with righteous judgment. I think this is on track to what he's talking about here. So as we go on, again, the author is talking about during my years of futility. He said, I tested all this with wisdom, and I said, I will be wise. But wisdom was far from me. What has been is remote and very mysterious. Who can discover it? He's referring to what he previously mentioned here in verse 15. He wanted to know, why do bad things happen to good people? Why did this happen to her? Why did this happen to him? Why is it like this? The wisdom of God surpasses. We'll never know. God only knows what befalls people, just like David. Why didn't God kill David? Yet he killed Uriah just for touching the ark, or the cart, or when he touched the ark, upon which was being hauled upon a cart. Why did God smite Uriah dead on the spot? And here David committed adultery, committed murder, really caused the death of many others. And he was spared. We have no indication from Scripture that Uriah was a wicked man. He was a faithful, loyal soldier, wasn't he? Why? 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 Well, and we just don't know things similar to that. Rather than be frustrated, we need to wait for God. But we know this in verse 29. But he goes on to say here, I directed my mind to know and to investigate and to seek wisdom and to seek an explanation and to know the evil of foolishness and the foolishness of insanity. And I discovered more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. Again, one who pleases God will escape from her, but the sinner won't. He will be captured by her. I was looking at this just right up to before class, trying to just, I don't know what you came up with this, but I think contextually, this is not talking about any particular literal physical female. Back in the book of Proverbs, in these verses here, wisdom was personified by Solomon as a woman. Wisdom kept being referred to as she. She will sustain you. She will guard you. She will protect you. But it was talking about God's wisdom. If you follow God, if you obey God, this wisdom, she will protect you. She will be an anchor. Wisdom was personified in Proverbs as a woman. And I think contextually that's exactly how we're to see this woman here. It is a woman that it personifies evil. The evil woman is more bitter than death because of the damage done. But this is why I say that. Look at this phrase. She can be escaped. The one who pleases God will escape her. That's the one who heeds God's wisdom. So when you read about this, woman, think of the term evil. I discovered as more bitter than death. The evil person whose heart is snares and nets. Not that a woman physically is the one who's wicked, because he goes on to say that men are that way too. Okay? But, and you all have any input to this?
Well, I don't have, didn't think about tying scripture to it, but just from other studies, if this is Solomon, it would make sense that it could be literal women, because that point is heart from God.
Yeah.
And it ties back a bit to verse 15. That verse 15
And Solomon could have, if he had obeyed God, would he have married all them women? What did the law say about multiplying wives? Same thing about multiplying horses. The king is not to do it. Don't do it. Solomon was one of many men who disregarded that. But the king, the law of Moses specifically forbade the king from doing that. So, we can't put all the blame on the women. It takes two. It's like an argument. You can't have an argument with one. It takes two to argue. So, yes, Solomon's heart did not remain loyal. And I read a lot of stuff too, Sam, that, you know, that certainly would apply if we were talking about women. I think, again, because, well, let's just move on and we'll see here. This is, the author is looking for someone who had the wisdom to know what he searched for. Obviously, he didn't. He said, I've looked and I've looked. I couldn't find. He said, I'm still seeking. I have found one man among 1,000, but I have not found a woman among all these. Behold, I have found only this, that God made people upright, but they've sought out many schemes. Even the author was looking for someone during his futile life. Does anybody know the answer? But I think that language is not to be literal here in verse 28 when he says, I found one man among 1,000. If it's literal, then the author is saying, I couldn't find out, but I checked with 1,000 men and I found one that knew the answer. Now, does that make sense? We use similar talk figuratively. I've asked everybody. Now, did we ask everybody? That's impossible. One among 1,000 meant there was a minute few righteous people. Now, what about this? That's not literally. Even though I found one man, I found 0 women. No. Again, this is why I think the woman, I found one among 1,000. He's talking about upright people. Okay? God made man upright. Well, when God made man upright, how many men were there? There was one. And how many women were there? What's happened from those two people? How many righteous people were there when the flood came? How many people How many people were in existence when the flood came? 1 in 1,000. That's the percentages. There was very few. Again, he said, I've discovered this, or this, and he doesn't mean I've understood it. He said, I've just found this to be the case. By adding one thing to another to find an explanation, which I'm still seeking, but haven't found. I found one man among 1,000, but I haven't found a woman among all these. Behold, I have found only this, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. Again, that's the only conclusion he reached about what went wrong with the world. Now, I looked, Sam, in looking about whether this was a woman and so forth. This one thing that I recognize, but I haven't had a chance to fully study it yet. Adam and Eve, one was put in subjection to the other. That we know, don't we? 1 Corinthians 11. The woman, her head is What does that play into this? You add to that, Solomon had many wives, 700, 300 wives, 700 concubines. Even if it was them, he would be saying, how many of them, of my wives and concubines, were upright? If so, would any of them, who turned his heart? His wives. Can we make an exception and say, well, there was one out of the 1,000 that was a godly woman, tried to say, Solomon, don't do this. This is what he's indicating here. I haven't found. During my time of futility, when my heart was following my wives, if it was him, how many persuaded him to follow God? There was none. So, again, that's kind of my ongoing study with this myself. But that's where I'm at right now. I welcome any input, anything that you come up with on that. But again, just remember, we're talking about things that exist because man has sought many schemes and deviated from living the way that God told him to live, the way that God purposed for him to live. And that's why God made man capable of being communicated to. God spoke to man. God spoke his will to Adam. He spoke his will to Eve. They knew. Eve even quoted when the devil came, has God said? Yes, God said. She knew what was prohibited. But we know what happened. So just remember, again, as we're going through this, it's wise to not question God. God is doing what he knows best because he knows the hearts. We may think someone is suffering unjustly. We're not God. And keep ourselves in mind. Rather than try to straighten someone else out without considering ourselves. It's not that we cannot pass judgment. We can't help but pass judgments. We make judgments every day. It may be about ourselves, but when we make decisions, we're making judgments. But let's make sure that we're not viewing ourselves as squeaky clean, sinless, spotless, and trying to just pass judgment on others, okay? Any other comments or questions you have? Okay, chapter 8. We've got 17 verses about obeying rulers. The reason that that's wise and to do that. So Lord's willing, we'll take up with that Sunday, okay? Thank you.